In the year 904 AD, a 15-year-old boy was crowned Pope of the Catholic Church, the spiritual leader of all Western Christianity. His name was Pope Sergius III. His first act as Pope, he ordered the murder of his two predecessors. One was strangled in prison, the other was suffocated to death. This wasn't an aberration. This was normal. For nearly 6 centuries, from roughly 500 to 1100 AD, the Catholic Church descended into what historians call the Dark Ages, a period so corrupt, so violent, so morally bankrupt that the Church itself later tried to erase it from history. Popes were murdered. Cardinals were bought and sold like commodities. The papacy became a prize fought over by noble families, with mistresses, illegitimate children, and assassinations determining who sat on the throne of Saint Peter. One period was so spectacularly corrupt that historians gave it a special name: the pornocracy, the rule of prostitutes. For 60 years, the papacy was controlled by a powerful Roman family whose matriarch installed her lovers' sons and grandsons as pope. Multiple popes kept mistresses in the Vatican. Some fathered dozens of children. Others sold church positions to the highest bidder. Several were accused of murder, adultery, and even, according to some accounts, devil worship. Today, everyone knows about modern Catholic scandals, the abuse crisis, the financial corruption, the cover-ups, but those pale in comparison to what happened during the Church's Dark Ages. How did an institution founded on the teachings of Jesus Christ, love, humility, service to the poor, become one of the most corrupt organizations in human history? How did the papacy turn into a prize fought over by aristocratic families using assassination, bribery, and sexual manipulation? And why, despite centuries of corruption so blatant that everyone knew about it, did the Church not only survive, but emerge even more powerful? Over the next 2 hours, we're going to explore how the Catholic Church went from persecuted minority to Europe's most powerful institution, the spectacularly corrupt pornocracy, when the papacy was controlled by a family of noblewomen and their lovers, the cadaver synod, when a dead pope was literally put on trial, how the Church sold salvation for profit through the indulgence system, the Borgias, a pope who poisoned his enemies and fathered multiple children while in office, and how these scandals eventually sparked the Protestant Reformation that split Christianity forever. This is the story the Church doesn't want you to know. The centuries they tried to bury. The scandals that nearly destroyed Christianity. This is the Dark Ages of the Catholic Church. Let's start with a question. How did the Catholic Church become so powerful that its corruption could last for centuries without destroying it? To understand that, we need to go back before the scandals, back before the power, back to when Christians were the ones being murdered. In the year 64 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. What followed was one of the most brutal persecutions in early Christian history. Christians were burned alive as human torches to light Nero's gardens. They were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. They were crucified by the hundreds. The Apostle Peter himself, Jesus' chief disciple, was crucified upside down in Rome. For the next 250 years, Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire. Christians met in secret, worshipped in catacombs beneath Rome, and faced periodic waves of persecution. They were a minority. They were hunted. They were killed. And yet, they grew. Why? What made Christianity spread despite persecution? Several factors. The promise of eternal life appealed to people living in a brutal, uncertain world. The community support system. Christians took care of their own, even strangers. The moral teachings that emphasized equality, compassion, and justice, martyrdom itself. Watching Christians die for their faith convinced others it must be true. Then, in 312 AD, everything changed. Constantine, a Roman general fighting for control of the empire, claimed he saw a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. A cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He won the battle, and he converted to Christianity. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. Suddenly, Christians weren't being thrown to lions. They were being invited to the imperial palace. By 380 AD, Emperor Theodosius made Christianity the official state religion of Rome. Pagan temples were closed. Other religions were suppressed. In less than a century, Christianity went from persecuted minority to official state religion of the most powerful empire on earth. Think about what that means. Christians went from hiding in catacombs to building massive basilicas, from being executed to executing others, from having no political power to being the empire's primary power broker. But this transformation came with a cost. When Christianity was illegal, being Christian meant risking your life. Only the truly committed joined. The early church was small, tight-knit, and intensely focused on its spiritual mission. Once Christianity became the official religion, being Christian became politically advantageous. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be Christian, not necessarily because they believed, but because it was good for their careers. Ambitious men saw the church hierarchy as a path to power and wealth. Rich families competed to get their sons appointed as bishops. Theological disputes became entangled with political power struggles. The church, which had once been defined by persecution and purity, began to be defined by something else: power. By the year 400 AD, the Catholic Church had developed a clear hierarchical structure. At the bottom, regular believers, the laity; above them, priests who administered local churches; above them, bishops who controlled cities and regions; above them, archbishops who controlled multiple dioceses. At the top, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, who claimed authority over all Christians. The Pope's authority rested on a specific claim: that Jesus had appointed Peter as the leader of the church, and that the Bishop of Rome was Peter's direct successor. Jesus' words to Peter in the Gospel of Matthew: "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." The bishops of Rome argued, Peter died in Rome. We are his successors. Therefore, we have ultimate authority over the entire church. But here's the issue. For the first few centuries, this claim was disputed. The Bishop of Constantinople argued he should have equal authority. After all, Constantinople was the new capital of the Roman Empire. The Patriarch of Alexandria claimed authority over the entire Eastern Church. The power structure of early Christianity was contested, ambiguous, and constantly being negotiated. Then, in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, swept through Western Europe. The old imperial administration crumbled, cities declined, trade networks broke down, literacy rates plummeted. Europe entered what we call the Dark Ages. But while the Roman Empire fell, the Roman Church survived. In fact, it thrived. Why? Because in the chaos following Rome's collapse, the Church was the only institution with organizational structure across multiple regions, literate administrators, monks and priests, moral authority that transcended tribal loyalties, accumulated wealth and land. Barbarian kings converted to Christianity not because of spiritual revelation, but because it legitimized their rule and gave them access to the Church's administrative infrastructure. Clovis, king of the Franks, converted in 496 AD. His entire army followed. The Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, all eventually converted, and each conversion gave the Church more power, more land, more wealth. By the year 500 AD, the Catholic Church had become something unprecedented in human history, a religious institution with spiritual authority over millions, political influence over kings and emperors, massive economic resources, land, taxes, donations, a bureaucratic structure spanning all of Western Europe. No effective oversight or accountability. What happens when you combine absolute spiritual authority with political power and immense wealth? What happens when an institution claims to speak for God but is run by ambitious, fallible human beings with no one to answer to? Corruption. On a scale that would make modern politicians blush. For the next 6 centuries, the Catholic Church would descend into an orgy of violence, greed, sexual scandal, and political manipulation that would shock even the most cynical observer. Let me tell you about the pornocracy. The period from 904 to 964 AD is known by historians as the pornocracy, or the rule of the harlots. Yes, that's the actual historical term. For 60 years, the papacy was controlled by a powerful Roman family, specifically by 3 women: Theodora, her daughter Marozia, and her granddaughter Theodora II. And these women didn't just influence the papacy, they controlled it. They installed their lovers as pope. They had popes murdered when they became inconvenient. They turned the throne of St. Peter into a family business. Theodora was the wife of Theophylact, a Roman consul and the most powerful nobleman in Rome around 900 AD. But Theodora was more than just a nobleman's wife. She was politically savvy, ruthlessly ambitious, and, according to contemporary sources, extraordinarily beautiful and charismatic. She had affairs with multiple powerful men, including several high-ranking clergy, and she used those relationships to control who became pope. Remember Sergius III, the pope I mentioned at the start, the one who murdered his predecessors? He was Theodora's lover, or maybe Marozia's lover. The historical sources are unclear about which woman he was sleeping with, possibly both. What we know for certain: Sergius III became pope in 904 AD with the backing of Theodora's family. His first acts were to order the murder of Pope Leo VII and the anti-pope Christopher, both of whom were strangled to death. Sergius III then had a son with Marozia, Theodora's daughter. That son would later become Pope John the XXIII. Think about that. A pope fathered a future pope with his mistress. This wasn't hidden. Everyone in Rome knew. It was just accepted. Marozia herself was even more influential than her mother. She was described by the historian Liutprand of Cremona as a shameless whore who exercised power on the Roman citizenry like a man. That's not a compliment. but it does tell us something. Marozia wielded real political power in a male-dominated society. During her lifetime, Marozia was responsible for installing at least 4 popes. Pope John X, 914–928, her lover, later murdered on her orders, Pope Leo VI, 928, lasted 7 months, Pope Stephen VII, 928–931, lasted 2 years, Pope John the Hussine, 931–935, her illegitimate son with Pope Sergius III. John V was actually a fairly competent pope. He organized military campaigns against Muslim raiders and worked to strengthen papal authority. But he made a fatal mistake. He tried to become independent from Marozia's control. So Marozia had him arrested, imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo, and suffocated with a pillow in 928 AD. After installing 2 placeholder popes who conveniently died quickly, Marozia made her move. She installed her own son, John X, as pope in 931 AD. John XII was in his early 20s. He was completely under his mother's control. For the next 4 years, Marozia was effectively the ruler of both Rome and the Catholic Church. But then, the family drama escalated. Marozia's son from her first marriage, Alberic II, grew jealous of his mother's power. In 932 AD, he led a coup, imprisoned his mother, and seized control of Rome. Marozia disappeared from history. She probably died in prison. Her son, Pope John X, remained pope, but was now controlled by his half-brother Alberic instead of his mother. Alberic II ruled Rome as a dictator for the next 22 years. The popes during this period were his puppets. They had spiritual authority, but no political power. This was actually an improvement. Alberic was brutal, but at least he kept some order in Rome. But Alberic made the same mistake as his predecessors. He mixed family and papacy. On his deathbed in 954 AD, Alberic forced the Roman nobility to swear that his son Octavian would become both the secular ruler of Rome and the next pope. They agreed, and in 955 AD, when Pope Agapetus II died, the 18-year-old Octavian was elected pope. He took the name John X. If you thought the previous popes were bad, John XI made them look like saints. Contemporary chronicles describe John XI as turning the Lateran Palace into a brothel, committing adultery with multiple women, including his own father's mistress, ordaining bishops in exchange for bribes, castrating a cardinal, blinding his confessor, committing incest with his sister and his niece, toasting the devil during church services, invoking pagan gods while gambling. Now we have to be careful here. Some of these accusations come from John XI's political enemies, and medieval chroniclers loved to exaggerate sexual scandals, but even accounting for exaggeration, it's clear John XII was spectacularly corrupt and incompetent. John XII's reign ended when he made a fatal political miscalculation. He invited Otto I of Germany to invade Italy and protect the papacy from local enemies. Otto came, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by John the Hussine in 962 AD, and then decided he didn't need the Pope's permission anymore. When John the Hussine tried to conspire against Otto, the emperor convened a church council that put the Pope on trial. The charges included adultery and fornication, ordaining a 10-year-old boy as bishop, blinding his spiritual father, confessor, castrating and killing a cardinal, setting buildings on fire, appearing in public wearing armor and weapons, drinking toasts to the devil. John the Hussine fled Rome before he could be officially deposed. He was replaced by Pope Leo VIII, John the Thean attempted to return to Rome and reclaim the papacy in 964 AD. He was successful. He drove out Leo VIII and resumed control, but 8 days later, he died. According to one account, he was killed by an enraged husband who caught John the Thean in bed with his wife. The husband beat the Pope to death. According to another account, he died of a stroke while having sex with a married woman. Either way, he died as he lived, in bed with someone else's wife. John the Thean's death essentially ended the pornocracy. Otto I maintained control over papal elections for the next several years, preventing any single Roman family from dominating. But the damage was done. For 60 years, the papacy, supposedly the representative of Christ on earth, had been controlled by a family that installed their lovers as pope, murdered popes who became inconvenient, fathered illegitimate children who later became pope, sold church positions for money, used the papacy to settle family scores. How did Christianity survive this? How did millions of Christians across Europe continue to follow a church whose leadership was so obviously, spectacularly corrupt? The answer: set up. The answer reveals something important about how institutional corruption works and why it's so hard to root out. But before we get there, I need to tell you about something even more bizarre than the pornocracy. I need to tell you about the time the Catholic Church literally put a dead body on trial. Eerie tone. In January of the year 897 AD, Pope Stephen VI did something that shocked even the corruption-hardened Romans of his era. He ordered his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had been dead for 7 months, to be dug up, dressed in papal vestments, propped up on a throne, and put on trial. This event is known as the Cadaver Synod, or Synodus Horrenda, the Horrible Synod. And it perfectly captures the insanity of papal politics during the Dark Ages. To understand why this happened, we need to understand the political situation in Rome during the late 800s. The papacy was caught between 3 competing powers: local Roman noble families fighting for control, the Carolingian rulers of France, various Italian duchies and kingdoms. Each faction wanted to control the Pope because controlling the Pope meant legitimacy, wealth, and political influence. Formosus became Pope in 891 AD. He was actually relatively competent and tried to navigate between these competing factions. But he made a fatal mistake. He crowned Lambert of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor, then changed his mind and invited Arnulf of Carinthia to invade Italy and take the crown instead. Formosus died in 896 AD before the political fallout could destroy him. Enter Stephen VI. Stephen VI became Pope in May 896 AD, just a few months after Formosus's death. Stephen was backed by the Spoleto family, the same family Formosus had betrayed by switching his support to Arnulf. They wanted revenge, but you can't punish a dead man, right? The exhumation. Wrong. In January 897 AD, Stephen VI ordered Formosus's corpse to be exhumed from its tomb. The decomposing body, dead for 7 months, was dressed in full papal vestments, complete with the papal tiara and pastoral staff. The corpse was then propped up on a throne in the Lateran Palace. The trial. A full church synod was convened. Bishops and cardinals gathered, forced to participate in this macabre spectacle. Pope Stephen VI personally presided over the trial, shouting accusations at the corpse. Why did you usurp the papacy? Why did you betray Lambert? Why did you violate church law by moving from one bishopric to another. The defense. The rotting corpse obviously couldn't respond, so Stephen 6:6 appointed a deacon to stand beside the body and speak on Formosis's behalf. Imagine being that deacon. You're standing next to a 7-month-old corpse in full papal regalia, being screamed at by the current pope, and you have to defend the dead body's actions. The verdict. Unsurprisingly, Formosus was found guilty. The verdict: Formosus had been unworthy of the papacy. All his acts as pope were declared null and void. Everyone he had ordained as priest or bishop was retroactively stripped of their positions. The punishment. Then came the punishment. The corpse's papal vestments were torn off. The 3 fingers of Formosus's right hand that had been used for blessing were cut off. The body was stripped naked and dragged through the streets of Rome by a mob. Finally, it was thrown into the Tiber River. The aftermath. The cadaver synod was too much even for Rome's jaded population. Public opinion turned sharply against Stephen VI. Riots broke out. The people was horrified by what the Pope had done. In August 897 AD, just 7 months after the trial, Stephen VI was arrested, thrown in prison, and strangled to death. The zombie Pope. But the story doesn't end there. Formosis's body was recovered from the Tiber by a monk and secretly buried. The next pope, Theodore II, annulled the cadaver synod and declared all of Stephen VI's actions void. Then Pope John IX held another synod that officially rehabilitated Formosus, declaring him a legitimate pope after all. Formosis's body was exhumed again, this time to be reburied with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. But wait, Pope Sergius III, the same Sergius who murdered his predecessors and fathered a future pope, reversed the reversal. He declared the cadaver synod valid, Formosus guilty, and anyone ordained by Formosus illegitimate. So for several decades, no one knew which priests and bishops were legitimate and which weren't, because it depended on which pope you believed was valid. The insanity. Think about the absurdity. A dead pope put on trial by his successor. The trial annulled by the next pope. The annulment annulled by a later pope. Clergy not knowing if they were legitimately ordained. The highest religious authority in Western Christianity completely dysfunctional. The deeper problem. The cadaver synod wasn't just a bizarre historical footnote. It revealed something fundamental about the medieval papacy. The office that claimed direct succession from St. Peter and ultimate spiritual authority over Christianity was completely controlled by whoever had the most political and military power in Rome at any given moment. The theological crisis. This created a genuine theological crisis. If the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth, chosen by the Holy Spirit, how can he be so obviously corrupt? If papal authority comes from God, why does it seem to come from whoever can murder or bribe their way to power? If the Church is holy, how can its leadership be so spectacularly unholy? The Church's answer. The Church's solution to this problem was theological innovation. They developed the doctrine of ex opere operato, the idea that the sacraments are valid regardless of the moral state of the priest performing them. In other words, yes, the Pope might be a murderer who bought his position, but when he says Mass, it's still a valid Mass. When he ordains a priest, that priest is still legitimately ordained. The office is holy, even if the man holding it isn't. The convenience. This doctrine was incredibly convenient for the church hierarchy. It meant that corruption at the top didn't invalidate the entire institutional structure. It meant believers didn't have to question whether their local priest's sacraments were valid just because the Pope in Rome was sleeping with his niece. But it also meant that corrupt church leadership could continue indefinitely without threatening the church's fundamental legitimacy. The pattern. And that's exactly what happened. For the next several centuries, the pattern continued. Popes bought and sold their position. Noble families controlled papal elections. Simony, selling church offices, was rampant. Clergy openly kept mistresses and fathered children. Church wealth was used for personal enrichment rather than charity. The question: how bad did it get? The transition. Let me tell you about the practice that became synonymous with church corruption. Let me tell you about indulgences, the system where the church literally sold salvation for cash. Act 2, the systematic corruption, 35 hours, 75 hours. Chapter 4, selling salvation, the indulgence scandal, $35, $48. Tone shift, explanatory but dark. Imagine you've committed a sin. Maybe you've stolen something. Maybe you've been unfaithful to your spouse. Maybe you've murdered someone. You confess to a priest. He gives you absolution. But according to medieval Catholic theology, absolution doesn't completely erase your sin. You still have to pay for it, either in this life, through penance, or in the next life, through time in purgatory. The concept of purgatory. Purgatory was conceived as a temporary hell, a place where souls were purified through suffering before being allowed into heaven. The amount of time you spent in purgatory depended on how many sins you'd committed and how serious they were. Murder might get you thousands of years in purgatory. Adultery, hundreds. Lying, decades. The innovation. But the church developed a solution: indulgences. An indulgence was essentially a get-out-of-purgatory-free card, or at least a reduce-your-purgatory-sentence card. The theological justification was complex, involving the treasury of merit. The idea that Christ and the saints had earned more grace than they needed, and the church could redistribute that excess grace to believers. The practice. Originally, indulgences were earned through acts of penance, going on a pilgrimage, fasting for a period, performing charitable works, attending certain religious services. If you completed these acts, the church would grant you an indulgence, reducing your time in purgatory by a specific amount, 50 days, 100 years, whatever the church decided. The corruption. But then someone realized, why make people actually do penance when they could just pay money instead? By the 11th century, the church was openly selling indulgences for cash. Need to reduce your purgatory sentence? Pay up. Want to ensure your dead relatives get into heaven faster? Buy them an indulgence. Planning to commit a sin? Buy a preemptive indulgence. The market. A whole market developed around indulgences. Different sins had different prices. Indulgences for the living cost less than indulgences for the dead. Wealthy people could buy plenary indulgences that completely remitted all punishment for all sins. The salesman. The church hired professional indulgence salesmen called pardoners or questors. These men traveled from town to town, setting up in marketplaces and selling indulgences like carnival barkers. One famous partner, Johann Tetzel, had a sales pitch that became legendary. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The pitch. Tetzel's sales technique was sophisticated and emotionally manipulative. He'd arrive in a town with great fanfare, flags, music, ceremony. He'd give a sermon describing the torments of purgatory in graphic detail. Souls burning, loved ones suffering, parents screaming for relief. Then he'd explain that for just a small donation, you could rescue your dead mother from centuries of agony. Listen to the voices of your dear dead relatives, he'd say. Hear them crying out, "Have mercy on me, have mercy on me. At least you, my friends, for the hand of the Lord has touched me." The guilt trip. You could save them right now, today, with just a small contribution. Will you abandon your mother to suffer for centuries when you could free her for the price of a loaf of bread? The hard sell. People mortgaged their homes to buy indulgences. Peasants spent their life savings. Parents prioritized buying indulgences over feeding their children. The church made staggering amounts of money. The justification. Church officials justified this by pointing to the good works the money would fund, building magnificent cathedrals, supporting monasteries and convents, funding crusades against Muslims and heretics, maintaining the papal court. St. Peter's Basilica. The most infamous example, the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Starting in 1506, Pope Julius II embarked on an ambitious project to demolish the old St. Peter's and build a new, grander basilica, the largest church in Christendom. This was an enormously expensive project. It would take over a century to complete and cost millions. How did the church plan to pay for it? Indulgences? The fundraising campaign. Pope Leo X launched a massive indulgence sales campaign across Europe specifically to fund St. Peter's construction. This is where Johann Tetzel comes in. He was hired by Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, who himself had purchased his position through massive loans from the Fugger banking family. The deal was, Tetzel would sell indulgences. The money would be split between paying off Albrecht's debts and funding St. Peter's construction. The breaking point. This shameless commercialization of salvation was too much for many Christians to stomach, and one monk in particular decided he'd had enough. His name was Martin Luther. The 95 Theses Preview. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, Germany. The document was a systematic attack on indulgences and church corruption. Thesis 27 directly attacked Tetzel's famous jingle. They preach only human doctrines, who say that as soon as the money clinks into the money chest, the soul flies out of purgatory. Thesis 86 asked, why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with the money of poor believers rather than with his own money? The spark. Luther intended to spark an academic debate about church reform. Instead, he ignited the Protestant Reformation, a religious revolution that would split Christianity, spark wars lasting decades, and permanently end the Catholic Church's monopoly on Western Christianity. The irony. The indulgence scandal, the Church's attempt to fund the construction of the grandest church in Christendom, ended up destroying the Church's unity forever. St. Peter's Basilica still stands today, one of the most magnificent buildings ever constructed. But the Christian unity the Catholic Church had maintained for over 1,000 years shattered. The broader corruption. But indulgences were just the most visible manifestation of a much deeper systemic corruption. The entire church hierarchy, from local priests to the Pope himself, was infected with practices that contradicted everything Christianity supposedly stood for. Let me tell you about simony. Simony, the buying of church offices. Simony, named after Simon Magus, who tried to buy spiritual power from the apostles, was the practice of buying and selling church positions. By the 10th and 11th centuries, it was completely normalized. Want to become a bishop? Pay the right price. Want your son to become a priest? Buy him a position. Want to control a lucrative monastery? Purchase the abbacy. The economics. Church positions were valuable because they came with guaranteed income from tithes and church lands, political influence, social status, legal privileges, clergy couldn't be tried in secular courts, opportunities for further enrichment. A wealthy bishopric could generate more income than a duchy. The position of archbishop was worth a fortune. The market. Noble families treated church positions like investments. They'd calculate, if I pay 10,000 marks for a bishopric that generates 2,000 marks annually, I'll break even in 5 years and profit thereafter. Younger sons who wouldn't inherit the family title were routinely purchased positions in the church. The consequences. This meant many, probably most, high-ranking clergy were not chosen for religious devotion or theological knowledge, not interested to spiritual leadership, focused on enriching themselves and their families, treating the church as a business rather than a religious institution. Clerical marriage and celibacy. The church officially required clergy to be celibate, unmarried, and abstinent. This rule was routinely ignored. Priests kept mistresses openly. Bishops fathered children. Popes had illegitimate sons who they appointed as cardinals. The technical term for these relationships was concubinage. Clergy couldn't legally marry, but they could maintain long-term relationships with women. The children. These illegitimate children of clergy were so common they had a special category: natural children, or bastards of the church. Many became priests themselves. Some became bishops. Several became pope. The nepotism. Nepotism literally means favoring your nephew, but in the church context, nephew was often a euphemism for illegitimate son. Popes would appoint their nephews as cardinals, bishops, and to other lucrative positions. This wasn't scandal. It was expected. Disappointing your family by not enriching them once you became pope would have been seen as a betrayal. The decay. By the early 16th century, the Catholic Church had become a thoroughly corrupt institution. Spiritual authority used for financial gain, salvation sold to the highest bidder, church positions purchased like commodities, clergy openly violating their vows, massive wealth concentrated at the top while local churches crumbled, religious mission subordinated to political and economic interests. The question, how did it get this bad, and why didn't anyone stop it? The answer: set up. People tried. Reformers had been calling for change for centuries, but those reformers faced a problem. The people with the power to reform the church were the same people benefiting from its corruption. Transition. Before we get to Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation, I need to tell you about the family that embodied church corruption at its absolute worst. I need to tell you about the Borgias. The Ricciossi, Chapter 5. The Borgias. Corruption made flesh. 48 wa 63 ya. Dramatic tone shift. If you were designing a family to represent everything wrong with the medieval Catholic Church, you couldn't do better than the Borgias. Murder, poison, incest, orgies, bribery, nepotism, warfare, illegitimate children, political manipulation, assassination. The Borgias did it all, and they did it from the Vatican. Rodrigo Borgia, the man. In 1492, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. He won the election through systematic bribery, buying votes from other cardinals with cash, lands, and promises of lucrative positions. This wasn't even particularly scandalous by 1492 standards. Everyone knew papal elections were bought and sold. What made Alexander VI special was what he did after he became Pope. His children. Alexander VI had fathered at least 7 illegitimate children before becoming Pope, possibly as many as 10. His most famous children were Cesare Borgia, made a cardinal at age 17, later became a military commander and brutal political operator Lucrezia Borgia, married off multiple times for political alliances, possibly involved in murders. Juan Borgia, murdered under mysterious circumstances, possibly by his brother Cesare. Joffre Borgia, married to a princess to secure a political alliance. No shame. Previous popes at least pretended to be celibate. They called their mistresses housekeepers and their children nephews. Alexander VI didn't bother. He openly acknowledged his children. He hosted them at the Vatican. He used the papacy to enrich them and advance their careers. Cesare Borgia. Alexander's son Cesare is one of the most fascinating and terrifying figures in Renaissance history. Made a cardinal at age 17 through his father's influence, Cesare was intelligent, charismatic, ruthless, and completely amoral. He became the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince, the ultimate handbook on cynical political power. Cesare's career. Cesare eventually abandoned the cardinalate to pursue military and political power directly. His father, the Pope, supported him with papal armies, church funds, political alliances, excommunication threats against his enemies. Cesare conquered large parts of central Italy, building a personal power base through violence, treachery, and intimidation. The methods. Cesare's tactics included inviting enemies to negotiate, then murdering them, using poison to eliminate rivals, or attempting to, betraying allies when convenient, marrying and divorcing for political advantage, employing a corps of assassins. One famous incident. Cesare invited several subordinates who he suspected of disloyalty to meet him at Senigallia. When they arrived, he had them arrested. 2 were strangled that night. The others were executed later. Lucrezia Borgia. Alexander's daughter Lucrezia has an even darker reputation, though modern historians debate how much is deserved versus propaganda from her family's enemies. She was married 3 times, each marriage arranged by her father for political advantage. Her first marriage was annulled when her father decided a different alliance was more advantageous. Her second husband was murdered, possibly on orders from her brother Cesare. Her third marriage, to the Duke of Ferrara, was relatively stable. The rumors. Lucrezia was rumored to be involved in multiple murders, possibly using poison. The Borgias were famous for poisoning enemies. More scandalously, she was rumored to have had incestuous relationships with both her father, Pope Alexander VI, and her brother, Cesare. The evidence. How much of this is true? The incest rumors are probably false or exaggerated. They come primarily from political enemies of the Borgias who had every reason to spread salacious gossip. But the murders and political manipulation, almost certainly true. The Banquet of Chestnuts. One event in particular captures the decadence of Alexander VI's papacy, the Banquet of Chestnuts, in October 1501. According to the diary of Johannes Burchard, the Pope's master of ceremonies, 50 prostitutes were invited to the Vatican. After dinner, chestnuts were scattered on the floor, and the prostitutes crawled around naked, collecting them. Then they engaged in sexual acts with the guests, while the Pope watched and kept score. Historical debate. Modern historians debate whether this event actually happened as described. Burchard's diary is the only source, and he had reasons to exaggerate. But even if we discount the most salacious details, the fact that such stories about the Pope were believable tells us something about Alexander VI's reputation. The papal lifestyle. What we know for certain: Alexander VI lived in extraordinary luxury, even by Renaissance standards. He hosted lavish banquets and entertainments. He kept multiple mistresses at the Vatican. He used church funds as his personal treasury. He appointed his children and mistresses' relatives to lucrative church positions. The military pope. Alexander VI also personally led military campaigns. Picture this: the Pope, supposedly Christ's representative on earth, successor to St. Peter, spiritual leader of Christianity, riding at the head of an army, besieging cities, negotiating territorial conquests. This wasn't metaphorical spiritual warfare. This was actual warfare with cannons, siege equipment, and thousands of soldiers. The diplomatic pope. Alexander VI was deeply involved in European power politics. He negotiated the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. He formed alliances with France, then betrayed them. He played Italian city-states against each other. He excommunicated enemies when politically convenient and absolved them when they became useful. The corruption machine. Under Alexander VI, the papacy became essentially a criminal enterprise masquerading as a religious institution. Every aspect of papal power was monetized. Want an annulment? Pay up. Want a dispensation from church rules? Pay up. Want a church position? Pay up. Want your sins forgiven? Pay up. Want your enemy excommunicated? Pay up. The murder of Juan. In 1497, Alexander's favorite son, Juan, was murdered. His body was pulled from the Tiber River with multiple stab wounds. The murder was never officially solved, but most historians suspect Cesare killed his brother out of jealousy. Juan was being groomed for greater power, while Cesare was stuck as a cardinal. Alexander was devastated. He threatened to reform the church and dedicate himself to spiritual matters. That lasted about 2 weeks. The death of Alexander VI. Alexander VI died in 1503, possibly from malaria, possibly from poison. One legend claims he and Cesare accidentally drank wine they had poisoned for an enemy cardinal. More likely, he died of a fever, during the notoriously disease-ridden Roman summer. The immediate aftermath. When Alexander died, his carefully constructed power structure collapsed immediately. Cesare, who had been ruthless and effective while backed by his father's papal authority, suddenly found himself vulnerable. His enemies moved against him. He was arrested, imprisoned, escaped, fled to Spain, and eventually died, fighting as a mercenary in 1507 at age 31. Lucrezia's later life. Lucrezia, meanwhile, became the Duchess of Ferrara and lived a relatively respectable life. She became a patron of arts and learning. She had several children. She participated in the governance of Ferrara. She died in 1519 at age 39, following childbirth. The legacy. The Borgia name became synonymous with corruption, murder, and sexual scandal. Their crimes and excesses became legendary, often exaggerated, but rooted in reality. They represent the absolute nadir of papal corruption. The incredible thing. But here's what's incredible. Even after the Borgias, the Catholic Church survived. People still attended Mass. They still considered the sacraments valid. They still believed in the Church's spiritual authority. Why? Several reasons. 1. The doctrine of ex opere operato. The sacraments work regardless of the priest's moral state. 2. Most people never saw the Pope or high church officials. Their experience of Christianity was their local priest, their local church, their community of believers. 3. There was no alternative. The church was the only game in town. If you wanted Christianity, you had to accept the Catholic Church, corruption and all. 4. Many local clergy were actually decent, pious people trying to serve their communities despite the corruption at the top. But there were people, reformers, mystics, theologians, who saw the corruption and wanted to fix it. Some tried to work within the system. They called church councils. They proposed reforms. They elected reform-minded popes. It never worked. The system was too corrupt, too entrenched, too profitable for those at the top. The alternative. Others decided the system couldn't be reformed. It had to be replaced. These people became heretics. The church burned them at the stake, until one reformer appeared who the church couldn't silence, a German monk who was willing to risk death to speak the truth, a man who would split Christianity forever. Martin Luther. Nouns. Chapter 6. The Reformers and Their Flames. 63, aisle 75. Somber, respectful tone. Before Martin Luther succeeded, dozens of reformers tried to fix the church. Many of them died horribly for trying. Let me tell you about a few. John Wycliffe, the Morning Star. John Wycliffe was an English theologian and priest who, in the 1370s, began publicly criticizing church corruption. His main arguments: the Bible, not the Pope, should be Christianity's ultimate authority. The church should be poor and humble, not wealthy and powerful. Ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in their own language. It was only available in Latin. Clergy, who lived in sin, had no legitimate authority. The translation. Wycliffe's most radical act. He translated the Bible into English. This was revolutionary and dangerous. The church insisted the Bible should only be available in Latin. That way, only educated clergy could interpret it. Wycliffe disagreed. He believed everyone should be able to read God's word for themselves. The Lollards. Wycliffe's followers, called Lollards, spread his teachings across England. They read from his English Bible. They criticized the church hierarchy. They rejected papal authority. The church was terrified. If people could interpret the Bible themselves, they wouldn't need priests. If they didn't need priests, the entire church hierarchy became unnecessary. Wycliffe's death. Wycliffe died of a stroke in 1384 before the church could execute him. But that didn't save him. In 1415, 31 years after his death, the Council of Constance declared him a heretic. In 1428, 44 years after his death, his body was exhumed, burned, and his ashes thrown into the river Swift. Even death couldn't protect you from the church's vengeance. Jan Hus, the Bohemian reformer. Jan Hus was a Czech priest influenced by Wycliffe's writings. He preached similar reforms. The church should return to biblical principles, the Pope could be wrong, ordinary believers should receive both bread and wine during communion. The church reserved wine for clergy only. Selling indulgences was wrong. The Council of Constance. In 1414, Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance to defend his views. He was promised safe conduct by Emperor Sigismund, a guarantee that he wouldn't be arrested or harmed. Hus went, trusting the emperor's word. The betrayal. The promise was broken. Hus was arrested immediately upon arrival. He was imprisoned for months in horrible conditions. He was tried for heresy. The trial was a farce. Hus wasn't allowed to properly defend himself. His accusers shouted him down. The verdict was predetermined. The execution. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was burned at the stake. As the flames rose, he sang hymns. Witnesses reported that he died praying. His last words were reportedly, "Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me." The aftermath. Hus's execution sparked outrage in Bohemia. The Hussite Wars followed, 15 years of brutal religious conflict between Hussites who followed Hus's teachings and Catholic forces trying to suppress them. Tens of thousands died. The church learned nothing. Girolamo Savonarola, the bonfire priest. Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar in Florence during the 1490s. He preached fiery sermons attacking the corruption of the church, the decadence of Renaissance Florence, the sins of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, the bonfires of the vanities. Savonarola convinced the people of Florence to burn their vanities, secular books, art, cosmetics, fancy clothes, playing cards, musical instruments. These bonfires of the vanities were massive public events where people voluntarily destroyed objects Savonarola deemed sinful. Modern observers see these bonfires as cultural destruction. Priceless artwork and manuscripts went up in flames, but to Savonarola's followers, they were acts of religious purification. Attacking the Pope. Savonarola made a fatal mistake. He directly attacked Pope Alexander VI. He called the Pope a false Christian. He said Alexander had bought the papacy through simony. He accused him of corruption and sin, all of which was true. But you don't publicly humiliate a pope, especially not a Borgia pope, and survive. The downfall. Alexander VI ordered Savonarola to stop preaching. Savonarola refused. The Pope excommunicated him. Savonarola ignored the excommunication. Finally, Alexander threatened to place Florence under interdict, essentially banning all church services in the city, unless the Florentines handed over Savonarola. The trial by fire. Savonarola's enemies challenged him to a trial by fire, walk through flames, and if God protected him, his teachings were true. Savonarola initially agreed, then tried to back out. His support collapsed. Arrest and execution. Savonarola was arrested in April 1498. He was tortured until he confessed to being a false prophet. He was hanged and burned in Florence's Piazza della Signoria on May 23, 1498. His ashes were scattered in the Arno River to prevent his followers from collecting relics. The pattern. Wycliffe, Huss, Savonarola. They all tried to reform the church. They all died, or in Wycliffe's case, were posthumously punished. They all failed to create lasting change. Why Luther succeeded. So why did Martin Luther succeed where they failed? Several reasons. Timing. Luther appeared at exactly the right moment, 1517. The printing press had been invented in 1450. Luther's 95 Theses could be reproduced and distributed across Europe in weeks, not years. Previous reformers' writings were laboriously hand-copied. They spread slowly. Luther's writings spread like wildfire. Political protection. Luther had powerful protectors, especially Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. Frederick protected Luther from arrest and execution. When the Pope demanded Luther be handed over, Frederick refused. Previous reformers lacked such protection. Popular support. Luther struck a chord with a broader population. The indulgence scandal was so blatant, so obviously corrupt, that even ordinary people who weren't theologians could see it was wrong. Luther wasn't just making theological arguments, he was attacking a practice that was directly emptying people's pockets. The German princes. German princes saw an opportunity. If they broke from Rome, they could stop sending money to the Vatican, seize church lands in their territories, gain independence from papal interference. Religious reform and political self-interest aligned perfectly. The point of no return. In 1521, Luther was summoned to the Diet of Worms to recant his writings. He was asked directly, "Will you revoke your books and the errors which they contain?" Luther's response is legendary. "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, I am bound by the Scriptures I had quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand, I can do no other. May God help me. Amen." The split. Luther didn't back down. His protectors didn't abandon him. His writings continued to spread. The Protestant Reformation had begun. Within a generation, huge swaths of Europe had left the Catholic Church. Most of Germany, Scandinavia, England, Scotland, parts of Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. The wars. The split sparked over a century of religious warfare. The German Peasants' War, 1524-1525, the Schmalkaldic War, 1546-1547, the French Wars of Religion, 1562-1598, the 30 Years' War, 1618-1648. Millions died. The Catholic response. The Catholic Church finally responded with the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, 1545-1563, implemented reforms. The Jesuit order was founded to combat Protestantism. The Inquisition was strengthened to root out heresy. Many, but not all, of the worst abuses were ended. The irony. The irony. The Church reformed itself in response to Luther. If they'd implemented these reforms a century earlier, if they'd listened to Wycliffe, Huss, or Savonarola, The Protestant Reformation might never have happened. The cost. But they waited too long. Christianity was permanently split. The Catholic Church's monopoly on Western Christianity was broken forever. Transition. The Dark Ages of the Catholic Church. The era of the pornocracy, the Cadaver Synod, the Borgias. The indulgence scandal finally ended, not because the Church chose to reform, but because it was forced to, not through internal renewal, but through external pressure, not because the leaders wanted change, but because they had no choice. Act 3. The Long Shadow. 75 Sun on 110 1 Tunes. Chapter 7. The Counter-Reformation and Reform. 75 and 87 Song. Tone shift, more balanced. After the Protestant Reformation split Christianity, the Catholic Church faced a choice: continue as before and lose more territory to Protestantism, or fundamentally reform itself. They chose reform. The period from roughly 1545 to 1650 is called the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation. The Council of Trent. The centerpiece was the Council of Trent, a series of meetings held between 1545 and 1563, where church leaders addressed the corruption and theological disputes that had sparked the Reformation. The Council made several important decisions. Doctrinal clarification. They clarified Catholic doctrine on issues Protestants had challenged. Salvation required both faith and good works. Protestants said faith alone. The Bible and church tradition both had authority. Protestants said Bible alone. Transubstantiation. The bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood. 7 sacraments, not 2. Purgatory exists. Saints can be venerated. Addressing corruption. More importantly, they addressed the corruption. Bishops must actually live in their dioceses. Many had been absentee landlords. Clergy must be educated. Seminaries were established to train priests properly. Simony, buying church offices, was officially banned and enforcement strengthened. Clerical concubinage was cracked down on more seriously. Indulgence abuses were ended. No more as soon as the coin in the coffer rings. The impact. These reforms were real and significant. The Catholic Church after Trent was noticeably different from the Church of the Dark Ages. Higher educational standards for clergy, better educated and more disciplined priesthood, less blatant corruption at the top, more focus on genuine religious devotion, better organization and administration. The Jesuits. One of the most important Counter-Reformation developments was the founding of the Jesuits, Society of Jesus, in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits were highly educated. They established schools and universities across Europe, disciplined and organized, military-style hierarchy and obedience, focused on missionary work. They spread Catholicism globally, effective debaters and teachers who could intellectually defend Catholic doctrine. The missionary expansion. While the Church was losing ground in Europe, it was expanding globally. Spanish and Portuguese colonization brought Catholicism to the Americas. Jesuits like Francis Xavier brought Catholicism to India, Japan, and China. The Philippines became a Catholic stronghold. Parts of Africa were evangelized. By 1650, the Catholic Church had transformed from a European institution to a truly global one. The Inquisition. The Counter-Reformation also had a dark side: intensified persecution of heresy. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, continued operating. The Roman Inquisition was strengthened in 1542 to combat Protestant heresy. The methods the Inquisition used: torture to extract confessions, forced conversions, execution of unrepentant heretics, burning at the stake, censorship. The Index of Forbidden Books banned texts the Church deemed heretical. Galileo. The Inquisition's most famous victim was Galileo Galilei. In 1633, Galileo was tried for heresy for supporting heliocentrism, the idea that Earth orbits the Sun, not vice versa. The Church insisted on geocentrism, Earth at the center, based on their interpretation of Scripture. Galileo was forced to recant under threat of torture. He spent his final years under house arrest. The irony. The Church had reformed its moral corruption, but became intellectually rigid. They'd stopped selling salvation for cash, but they were still silencing scientists who contradicted their world view. The legacy of Trent. The Council of Trent's reforms lasted centuries. The Catholic Church that emerged from Trent was the church that existed until Vatican II in the 1960s, over 400 years of relative stability. What didn't change? But some things didn't change. Papal authority remained absolute. The hierarchy remained rigid. Women remained excluded from clergy. Church wealth remained substantial. Political involvement continued. The Papal States. The Pope remained a political ruler, governing the Papal States in central Italy until 1870. Popes continued to command armies, make alliances, and involve themselves in European power politics. The mixing of spiritual and temporal power, one of the root causes of medieval corruption, continued. The 19th century crisis. The 1800s brought new challenges. The Enlightenment promoted reason over religious authority. The French Revolution attacked the Church's political power. Liberalism and democracy challenged hierarchical authority. Science increasingly contradicted Church teachings. Nationalism reduced the Pope's political influence. Papal infallibility. The Church's response doubled down on papal authority. In 1870, at the First Vatican Council, Pope Pius IX declared the doctrine of papal infallibility. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra, from the chair of Peter, on matters of faith and morals, he is infallible, incapable of error. The paradox. This happened the same year. The Papal States were conquered by Italy, and the Pope lost his temporal political power. As the Pope's actual political power vanished, the Church declared his spiritual authority to be absolute and infallible. Transition to modernity. By 1900, the Catholic Church had transformed. The worst medieval corruptions were largely gone. The Counter-Reformation reforms had created a more disciplined institution. Global expansion had made it a worldwide church, but it remained authoritarian, hierarchical, and resistant to modernity. The 20th century. The 20th century would bring both triumph and trauma. Vatican II, 1962-1965, modernized many practices. The Church's role in opposing communism, rapid growth in the developing world, continued decline in Europe, and new scandals that would shake the Church to its foundations. Transition. Because here's the thing about institutional corruption. You can reform the system. You can improve the structures. You can crack down on blatant abuses. But if you don't address the underlying issues, unaccountable power, institutional secrecy, prioritizing the institution over victims, new forms of corruption will emerge, and that's exactly what happened. Chapter 8. Modern Echoes, The Abuse Crisis, 87 Juars, 105, EUA. Serious, careful tone. Content warning. This chapter discusses clergy sexual abuse, including abuse of minors. If you need to skip this section, the next chapter begins at timestamp. Introduction. The Catholic Church's dark ages weren't limited to the medieval period. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the world discovered that the Church had been harboring and protecting clergy who sexually abused children for decades. This wasn't isolated incidents. It was systemic. It was covered up at the highest levels. And the patterns of behavior, prioritizing the institution over victims, using power to silence critics, refusing accountability, echoed the worst abuses of the medieval Church. The scope. How widespread was the abuse? Reports and investigations have documented thousands of priests credibly accused of abuse, tens of thousands of victims. The true number is likely higher, abuse occurring in dozens of countries across all continents. Patterns stretching back decades, possibly centuries. The cover-up. What made this scandal particularly horrifying wasn't just the abuse itself. It was how church leadership responded, moving abusive priests to new parishes instead of reporting them to police, silencing victims through legal settlements with confidentiality clauses, lying to parishioners about why priests were being transferred, protecting the institution's reputation over protecting children, using church law to avoid secular legal accountability. The Boston Globe investigation. The modern awareness of the crisis began in 2002 when the Boston Globe published the results of an extensive investigation. Their reporting revealed dozens of priests in Boston alone had abused hundreds of children. Cardinal Bernard Law had systematically covered up the abuse. The pattern extended far beyond Boston. The Boston Globe's reporting won the Pulitzer Prize and was later dramatized in the film Spotlight. Cardinal Law's case. Cardinal Law's case is instructive. He knew about abusive priests. He had documentation. He received complaints from victims and parents, and he transferred those priests to new parishes where they abused again. When the scandal broke, Law resigned as Archbishop of Boston in 2002. His punishment? He was given a prestigious position at the Vatican. The pattern. This pattern repeated worldwide. Ireland. Government investigations found massive abuse in Catholic institutions, with church and state authorities covering it up. Australia. The Royal Commission found over 4,000 victims and pervasive institutional failure. Germany. A 2018 report identified at least 3,677 abused children and a systematic cover-up. Chile. A 2018 crisis where every bishop offered to resign due to abuse scandals. Pennsylvania. A 2018 grand jury report identified over 1,000 victims and 300 accused priests. The Vatican's response. For years, the Vatican's response was inadequate. Denial that there was a systemic problem. Claims that abuse was no more common in the Church than elsewhere. Resistance to meaningful reforms. Protection of bishops who covered up abuse. Legal battles against victims seeking justice. Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI, 2005-2013, took some steps, met with abuse victims, defrocked some abusive priests, acknowledged the Church had failed victims. But critics argued his response was too little. too late. Pope Francis. Pope Francis, 2013 present, has been more active, called abuse an abomination, met with victims more openly, removed some bishops who covered up abuse, changed canon law to make reporting abuse mandatory, convened a summit on abuse prevention in 2019. But skeptics note, concrete actions often lag behind rhetoric. Bishops who covered up abuse rarely face real consequences. Institutional resistance to transparency remains strong. The culture of secrecy persists. The underlying issues. Why did this happen? Several factors. Clericalism. Clericalism, the idea that clergy are set apart from and above ordinary believers, creates a culture where priests aren't held accountable. Celibacy. Mandatory celibacy doesn't cause abuse. Most abusers are not celibate clergy, but it may attract psychologically unhealthy individuals to the priesthood and create an environment where sexual dysfunction isn't addressed. Power imbalance. The Church's hierarchical structure concentrates power at the top with little accountability. Bishops answer to the Vatican. The Pope answers to no one. Victims have little recourse. Institutional self-preservation. Like medieval church leaders, who prioritized maintaining their power over living up to Christian ideals, modern church leaders often prioritized protecting the institution's reputation over protecting children. Secrecy. Canon law, the Church's internal legal system, operates in secret. Cases of abuse were handled internally, away from public scrutiny and secular legal systems. This allowed abuse to continue unreported and unpunished. The parallels to the Dark Ages. The abuse crisis shares troubling similarities with medieval corruption. Prioritizing institutional power over moral principles, using spiritual authority to silence critics, protecting corrupt leaders rather than holding them accountable, resisting external oversight, claiming the institution is above secular law. The difference. There is one crucial difference. The modern abuse crisis involves crimes against the most vulnerable, children. Medieval popes might have lived in luxury, kept mistresses, and murdered rivals, but they weren't systematically protecting child abusers. In this respect, the modern scandal is worse. The ongoing crisis. The crisis isn't over. New cases continue to emerge. Victims continue seeking justice. Church leaders continue resisting reforms. Financial costs of settlements are in the billions. Trust in the Church continues declining. The victims. Most importantly, thousands of people were traumatized by abuse and betrayal. Their childhood faith was weaponized against them. Their trust was violated. Their trauma was dismissed. Their justice was denied. The question: can the Church recover from this? Can an institution that has repeatedly shown it will protect itself over the vulnerable ever truly reform? The hope. Some argue yes. Most clergy are decent people genuinely trying to serve. The Church has survived worse crises before. Reforms, though slow, are happening. Younger Catholics are demanding change. Greater transparency and accountability are possible. The skepticism. Others argue the fundamental structure is the problem. Absolute papal authority with no accountability, culture of clericalism and secrecy, resistance to transparency, prioritizing institutional preservation over justice. Without changing these fundamental issues, they argue reform is impossible. Transition. Whether the Church can truly reform remains an open question, but understanding the history of Church corruption, from the pornocracy to the present, helps us understand why reform is so difficult. Institutional corruption isn't just about individual bad actors. It's about structures, incentives, and cultures that enable and protect abuse of power. Let's wrap up by looking at what we've learned and what it means. Chapter 9. Why They Survived. The Persistence of Faith. 105, Arta, 110, Fas. Reflective tone. We've covered a lot of ground in the past 100 minutes. Popes who murdered their predecessors, the papacy controlled by mistresses, dead bodies put on trial, salvation sold for cash, the Borgias, the Protestant Reformation, and modern abuse scandals. Through it all, one question looms. How did the Catholic Church survive? The durability. The Church has survived. The fall of the Roman Empire, Muslim conquests, the Great Schism, split with Eastern Orthodoxy in 1054, the pornocracy, the Protestant Reformation, losing half of Europe, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the loss of the Papal States, modern secularization, the abuse crisis. What makes it so resilient? Reason 1. Separation of office and person. The theological innovation we discussed earlier, ex opere operato, protected the institution from leadership corruption. When people believe the sacraments work regardless of the priest's moral state, corrupt leaders don't invalidate the entire system. Reason 2. Local experience. Most Catholics' experience of the Church wasn't the Pope in Rome. It was their local parish, their local priest, their community of believers. Even when papal corruption was notorious, most local clergy were just trying to serve their communities. Reason 3. No alternative. For most of Church history, Christianity meant Catholicism in Western Europe. If you wanted to be Christian, you had to accept the Catholic Church, corruption and all. This changed with the Reformation, but even then, most Catholics stayed Catholic. Reason 4. Genuine faith. Despite leadership corruption, millions of people experienced genuine spiritual meaning through Catholic practice, the Mass and sacraments, prayer and contemplation, community and charity, art, music and architecture, saints and devotional practices. The corruption at the top didn't negate the real spiritual experiences of ordinary believers. Reason 5. Institutional inertia. The Church built enormous institutional infrastructure over centuries. Thousands of churches, monasteries and schools, vast landholdings and wealth, complex administrative systems, legal privileges and protections, deep integration with European society. This infrastructure gave the Church incredible staying power, even during crises. The paradox. Here's the paradox. The same structures that enabled corruption, centralized authority, institutional self-preservation, resistance to accountability, also enabled survival. The Church's durability comes from the same sources as its corruption. The lesson. What does the Church's dark history teach us? About institutions. Institutions prioritize their own survival above their stated missions. When institutions gain power without accountability, corruption follows. Reform from within is extremely difficult, usually requires external pressure. About power. Power corrupts, especially absolute power with divine justification. Religious authority combined with political power creates particularly dangerous corruption. Leaders will often choose institutional preservation over justice for victims. About faith. Genuine faith can coexist with institutional corruption. People can maintain spiritual beliefs while recognizing their institutions are flawed. But institutional corruption eventually undermines faith, as we see in declining church attendance today. Transition to conclusion. The Catholic Church's dark ages, from the pornocracy to the present, tell us something important about human institutions and human nature. We build institutions to serve ideals. Those institutions accumulate power. Power attracts people who want power more than they care about ideals. Corruption follows. The question isn't whether institutions will become corrupt. It's how we create accountability and transparency to minimize corruption and enable reform. The Catholic Church struggled with this for over 1,000 years. In many ways, it still does. Chapter Act 4. Reckoning and Reflection. 110 120 Shadow. Chapter 10. The Dark Ages and What They Teach Us. 110 120 Shah. Final reflective tone. 2 hours ago, I started with Pope Sergius III, murdering his predecessors in 904 AD. Now you know the full story. 6 centuries of spectacular corruption. Popes who bought their position. Cardinals who killed their rivals. The papacy controlled by mistresses. Dead popes put on trial. Salvation sold for profit. Religious authority weaponized for personal gain. And then, when forced to reform, patterns of secrecy and institutional self-preservation that enabled new forms of abuse. The core question answered. How did an institution founded on Jesus Christ's teachings become so corrupt? The answer: power. When Christianity went from persecuted minority to state religion in the 4th century, the Church gained power. When the Roman Empire fell and the Church filled the vacuum, the Church gained more power. By the medieval period, the Church had spiritual authority over millions, political influence over kings, and vast economic resources, and no one could hold it accountable. The pattern. The pattern was predictable: absolute spiritual authority plus political power, immense wealth, no accountability, corruption. We saw it play out in the pornocracy, 904-964, sexual scandal and murder, the Cadaver Synod, 897, insane power struggles, indulgences, 11th-16th centuries, commercializing salvation, the Borgias, 1492-1503, peak corruption, modern abuse crisis, 20th-21st centuries, protecting predators, the victims. Through all this, the real victims were, in the medieval period, ordinary believers who thought they were buying their way to heaven. Reformers burned at the stake for telling the truth. Poor people taxed to build magnificent churches. Communities torn apart by religious wars. In the modern period, children abused by clergy, families destroyed by institutional betrayal, people who lost their faith due to institutional corruption. What hasn't changed? Certain patterns persist: prioritizing institutional reputation over justice, using secrecy to hide problems, protecting leaders rather than holding them accountable, resisting external oversight, claiming special status that puts the Church above secular law. These are the same patterns that enabled medieval corruption. What has changed? Some things have improved. No more selling indulgences. No more popes murdering predecessors. No more dead bodies put on trial. No more popes fathering future popes. Better education, and training for clergy. More transparency, though still insufficient. The reform question. Can the Church truly reform? Two perspectives. The optimistic view. Yes, because the Church has reformed before. Council of Trent. Most clergy are decent people committed to serving. Younger Catholics are demanding change. External pressure, legal, media, financial, is forcing accountability. Some meaningful reforms are happening. The skeptical view. No, because the fundamental power structure hasn't changed. Papal authority remains absolute. Culture of clericalism persists. Institutional self-preservation remains the priority. Previous reforms took centuries and happened only under extreme pressure. The truth. Probably somewhere in between. Reform is possible, but difficult. Changes happen slowly. External pressure is necessary, and the tension between ideals and institutional interests will always exist. The broader lesson. The Catholic Church's story isn't unique. Every powerful institution faces similar tensions. Governments that claim to serve the people but protect the powerful. Corporations that claim ethical values but prioritize profit. Universities that claim to seek truth but protect their reputation. The Church's corruption is a case study in institutional failure, but the patterns apply broadly. The warning. Any institution that combines claims of moral, spiritual, ideological authority, concentrated power, lack of transparency, resistance to accountability, culture of protecting the institution over individuals will eventually become corrupt. The solution. What's the solution? Accountability mechanisms that can actually punish leaders, transparency that exposes problems before they metastasize, external oversight that isn't captured by the institution, culture that prioritizes principles over institutional preservation, willingness to admit mistakes and make real changes, applying to the Church. For the Catholic Church specifically, this might mean independent oversight boards with real power, mandatory reporting to civil authorities, public transparency about abuse cases, consequences for bishops who cover up abuse, structural reforms to distribute power more broadly, cultural changes to reduce clericalism. The resistance. But these reforms face enormous resistance because they require those in power to voluntarily give up power, which is why reform usually requires external pressure: legal, financial, reputational. The faith question. What about faith itself? Does church corruption invalidate Christianity? That's for each person to decide. Some conclude, if the institution is this corrupt, the faith itself must be false. Others maintain the institution is human and flawed, but the faith itself can be true. The Church's dark ages don't resolve theological questions, but they do force us to distinguish between religious faith and belief, institutional power and corruption, spiritual ideals and human failure. The historical importance. Understanding this history matters. It explains the Protestant Reformation, not just theological disputes, but necessary response to corruption. It illuminates modern scandals, same patterns, new forms. It teaches us about institutional corruption generally. It reminds us that even the most powerful institutions are human creations, fallible and corruptible. The final reflection. For 6 centuries, the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in Western civilization. It shaped culture, politics, art, philosophy, and daily life. It preserved learning through the Dark Ages, built magnificent cathedrals, and sponsored some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. It also murdered reformers, sold salvation, protected criminals, and repeatedly prioritized institutional power over moral principles. The complexity. History is complex. Institutions are complex. People are complex. The Catholic Church contains both. Genuine spiritual seeking and cynical power-grabbing, beautiful art and brutal violence, selfless service and selfish corruption, transcendent ideals and human failure. The takeaway. The Church's Dark Ages teach us power without accountability leads to corruption. Institutions prioritize self-preservation over stated values. Reform requires external pressure and internal courage. History matters. Patterns repeat. Faith can survive institutional failure, but institutions can destroy faith. The unresolved question. Whether the Catholic Church can fully reckon with its past and reform for the future remains an open question. History suggests it's possible, but difficult. The victims of abuse deserve justice. Ordinary believers deserve honest leadership. Future generations deserve institutions that live up to their ideals. The closing. The Catholic Church's Dark Ages lasted centuries. They involved spectacular corruption, systematic abuse of power, and repeated prioritization of institutional interests over human dignity. They nearly destroyed Christianity. They ultimately forced reform, but only under extreme pressure and after immense human cost. The hope. Perhaps the lesson is this: institutions will always tend toward corruption. That's human nature. But exposure, accountability, and persistent pressure can force reform. The work is never finished. Vigilance is always necessary. And the ideals, justice, compassion, truth, are worth fighting for, even when the institutions claiming them fail. The very end. Thank you for spending 2 hours exploring the Catholic Church's Dark Ages, from the pornocracy to the present, from selling salvation to systematic cover-ups, from the corruption that split Christianity to the scandals that continue today. This history is uncomfortable. It's disturbing. It challenges what many people believe about religious institutions. But it's true, and understanding it helps us understand not just Catholic history, but how power works, how institutions corrupt, and why accountability matters. The Church's Dark Ages aren't just ancient history. The patterns persist. The lessons remain relevant. Stay curious. Stay skeptical. Demand accountability from powerful institutions. And remember, ideals matter, but institutions always fall short. The question is whether we have the courage to demand they do better.